to join. Holly, I'm going to let you continue to admit people in. Okay. All right. Good morning. I'm Lesley Coghill from Resilience. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Unearthing the Roots of Domestic and Sexual Violence, hosted by Resilience, Advocates for Ending Violence. I want to make sure here, hopefully you can hear everything. So Resilience serves Ottawa and Allegan counties, and our mission is to respond to, reduce, and prevent domestic and sexual violence. We want to start by showing our agency video as an introduction. So we'll do that now.
When it comes to physical, mental, and sexual violence,
only you can decide how to move forward.
No one can tell you what to do.
The path is not always clear,
And the unknown can be frightening. But knowledge is power.
At Resilience, we're not here to tell. We're here to show. Teach you about options. Provide a safe place to think. Connect you with people who know. Help you find the resources needed to move forward in whatever way you choose. Since 1977, we've seen the need for help in Ottawa and Allegan counties, and we've grown accordingly. We've expanded our reach, evolved our services, and created new partnerships and programs to stop abuse before it starts. No matter who you are, female, male, LGBTQI, religious or not, abuse is real. When you need safety, Resilience can shelter you. When you feel legally or financially trapped, Resilience is here every day, all day, ready to listen, educate, or act.
Because this is our community, our community, our community, our community.
And there's no place for abuse in it.
Okay. We wanted to give you that introduction to show you who we are as an organization. Maybe you are familiar with us, but we do have lots of direct services and prevention services for those who experience domestic and sexual violence. These issues are extremely pervasive. And today's session, Unearthing the Roots of Domestic and Sexual Violence, is really looking at the underlying issues and risk factors.
Leslie?
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, but we've got people in the waiting room, and for some reason, I'm not able to let them in. So Alicia or Lesley, if you could let them in, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. There we go. Great.
I appreciate that. So I just wanted to thank everyone for being a part of today's session. This session is being recorded. The slides will be available after the session along with an evaluation. So we'll be sending that to you in a communication afterwards. I want to offer a trigger warning. These issues are really hard to hear. We will be playing a clip from a film called Misrepresentation. There is strong language and sexual content. Our conversation is going to address sexual objectification. And so we want to just let you know about that and take care of ourselves as we talk about these really important issues of domestic and sexual violence. So to get started, we know that from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's data that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men have experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking in an intimate relationship, and have experienced some kind of negative impact, such as experiencing injury, where they've needed hospitalization or treatment, or they've experienced fear where they've needed to get a personal protection order or services or trauma therapy or counseling as a result of the trauma that they experienced. We want to acknowledge that these are extremely pervasive issues and that any person, women and men, transgender women and men, queer individuals, non-binary individuals, any person can experience domestic and sexual violence. For our time together today and for this training, we are going to focus on gendered oppression and specifically around violence against women. In many ways, the things that we talk about are pretty universal to all survivors. And certainly we've had trainings on, my colleague just did a training last month on male survivors who experience trauma from sexual assault. So talking about male survivors is very important too. And just want to make that clear that today's conversation is about violence against women, but all violence is important to talk about. All survivors deserve help. So with that said, let's go on with our focus of our objectives today. We are going to look at some tools. I'm going to share a lot of tools from Centers for Disease Control and Prevention with you. We'll be looking at the social ecological model. I'll share a tool with you from their website called the Connecting the Dots tool, which really shows how what the risk factors and protective factors are across the social ecological model. And you can look at it with different types of violence. So we'll take a look at that. But we're going to be looking at the risk factors, the systemic oppression, and understand how systemic oppression of women can contribute to perpetuating the problem of domestic and sexual violence. And we will end with and spend a great amount of time on looking at specific prevention strategies across the social ecology. So those are the three things we'll address: gender depression, risk factors, and prevention strategies. I'd like to introduce myself and then let my colleague Alicia introduce herself. I'm Lesley Coghill. I have a master's in social work, and I've worked at Resilience for over 17 years in primary prevention work and largely in community education, working with K-12 schools and community organizations, promoting primary prevention of domestic and sexual violence, promoting healthy masculinity, healthy relationships, bystander intervention skills, so that we're promoting healthy, safe relationships. And I'll hand it over to Alicia.
Great. Thank you, Lesley. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Alicia LaGuardia-LoBianco. I'm an assistant professor at Grand Valley State University, and I do feminist philosophy and ethics. So Resilience really stood out to me as a wonderful organization that I wanted to get involved with, and Lesley was kind enough to let me. So yeah, I'm ready to go when you are. Awesome. Okay, great. So thank you all again for coming. We're really excited about this. Just to reiterate a little bit what Lesley said, we're going to be looking at, and I'm going to be specifically looking at, these base ground structures, these social and cultural features that can play some role in these other risk factors that Lesley will be focusing on. So this is sort of the broadest set of conditions that I'm worried about, these social and cultural factors. And again, we're going to be focusing on oppression against women and how that contributes to violence against women. But again, just to reiterate, that does not mean that only women are victims of sexual and domestic violence. As Lesley said, right, all of the other risk factors for other identities are worth their own presentation. But for us, right, since this is such a predominant pattern of violence against women, it's worth looking at in its own right. So that's the plan for today. So having said that, one way to start thinking about these broader social and cultural factors that underlie these more particular risk factors is to think about it in terms of oppression, gendered oppression. So one definition that you have right up on the screen is A social group is oppressed when members of that group face systemic disadvantages, barriers, and limitations. And they face those limitations by virtue of being a member of that group. So we're going to look at how women, just because they're women, face a certain systemic set of related barriers and limitations. Thank you. So more specifically, one particular theory of oppression comes from feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye, and we can think of this as the birdcage model. So she starts with this concept of double binds. So a double bind is just any situation where a person has some set of options to take, but whatever they choose, there's some cost to bear. So whatever they do, there's some sort of cost. So one example that Frye gives for women, a double bind that many women may face, has to do with the choice over sexual activity. So a woman may choose to engage in sexual activity or be perceived to do so, and thereby risks being called a slut, right? Or she may choose to refrain from sexual activity, again, or may be perceived to do so, and then she risks being called a prude, right? So cost either way. And these costs can range in severity. And also it's worth noting, they don't always have to be in this sort of either or structure. Basically, it just means that whatever feasible option a person has comes with some attendant cost. And we're going to get into those in a little more detail in a second, but just to give you the big picture here, the way Frye sets this up is to say, all right, we have these sort of individual double binds, slut or prude and everything else. But if we zoom out a bit and we kind of look at this larger pattern of all these individual restrictions, we can start to see how they are all kind of working together to enclose that group, to restrict that group's options. So what we have up here, that's a third bullet point. The birdcage model is a system of related double binds, that work together to restrict that group, much like the wires of a birdcage. So each individual restriction is just one little wire, but when we look at these broader social patterns, they work together to restrict that group. So that's the basic idea, but we're going to look at double binds for women in a little bit more detail. And first, I just want to flag that, of course, different intersectional identities will face different and unique double binds by virtue of their unique experiences and oppressions. So just two really quick examples, just to give you an idea of what I mean. So for instance, a Black woman who is perhaps in a work setting who needs to be assertive about some issue, right? She risks being viewed as the angry Black woman stereotype, right? Which a white woman probably wouldn't have to worry about. The other option for this woman is not saying anything, right? Sort of keeping her mouth closed, but then of course she risks not being heard, not being assertive. And then one last example, this is from another philosopher, her name is Talia May Betcher. Transgender women face a unique double bind in which they have a choice to conceal their identity as trans. Then they risk being revealed, right? Not really, but revealed and being called a deceiver, right? You made me think you were something you weren't, according to the transphobic stereotypes that operate in our country. Or that woman may face the option of revealing her identity, being forthright about it, and then she risks being viewed as merely pretending, just dressing up in women's clothes, right? More transphobic stereotypes. So those are just some examples about how these restrictions can work a little differently depending on who we're talking about. But for our purposes, let's look at all the double binds, right? We're going to ask you to just use the chat to just think of some restrictions that exist for women. Whatever double binds you want to put up there, and then we'll talk through them, please. So my one example was from Frye, right? Either she's a slut or she's a prude, right? What are some other examples of how, right, whatever a woman chooses, she might get some sort of censure for it? Oh, great, yeah. Oh, nice, oh, good. Oh gosh, Minnesota, right. Okay, these are fantastic. So let me start at the top and feel free to bring on some more of them. So we have We have a few about, okay, the way a woman dresses, virginity or purity, sexy, attractive, right? So there does seem to be these norms and expectations about how women look and how they perform sexually, right? So yeah, what they wear, either you're too covered up, or if you wear something revealing, you're asking for it, you're just a slut again, right? Yeah, so this virgin, right? Either you're pure and you're a virgin and sacred, but as soon as you have sex, you're degraded somehow, right? So good, so attitudes or behaviors too, right? This sort of bitchiness, right? This assertiveness, which really is just basic assertiveness, but it could be viewed as bitchiness versus being passive, submissive. Good. And then we have a few here that say, yeah, this question about career versus kids, right? That's a double bind that attaches to women probably far more often than it does to men, at least in our country. So there's some sacrifice that she may have to make no matter what. And that is because of how we've set up things like maternity leave and careers and things like that, along with expectations that women should be taking care of kids, right? Female athletes are butch. Oh yeah, we're seeing that with the March Madness going on and everything there too. Right, good. Minnesota seems to think women can't drink and still be raped. So that victim blaming that comes into it. Yep, exactly. Being a career focused appears anti-family, good. And being family focused makes her viewed as lazy, right? Just living off in a heterosexual setting, her husband, right? The feminist killjoy or being a doormat, yeah. I hear that one a lot as a feminist philosophy professor. Okay, fantastic, y'all. That's great. Thank you so much for that. So perfect. So there's a lot more we could say about this, but you could already sort of see that some themes emerge from just the few of the double binds that you've put up here. And again, there's plenty, but we're going to focus on two that are especially relevant for us. And the first is objectification, right? So all those issues about how a woman looks and how she's expected to look, makeup, no makeup, dress, whatever. Those all have to do with monitoring women's appearance and bodies and sexuality, heavily and punitively monitored. That is, there's an expectation for how women should look and appear. That expectation is largely in line with the male gaze, right? How men sort of want her to appear. And there are, more or less extreme consequences when there's a failure to reach that expectation. So that's one theme. And the second theme just comes out of the sort of essentializing gender stereotypes that we're all kind of socialized to know about, right? And this came out in this idea of being, if you have a career, you're anti-family, and if you don't, then you're lazy, right? This expectation that women are nurturers, right? They're delicate, they take care of others, they're passive, fragile, less capable, weaker than men, less intelligent than men, right? So this is all just part of that gender socialization, as we know, that says women are over here on the weak side and men are over here in this box on the strong stoic side, and never the twain shall meet, right? They're mutually exclusive there. So great, so those are two of those themes, and we'll talk about them in a minute a bit more, but I believe now we have a clip from the Misrepresentation movie, so I'm gonna let Lesley do that.
The media is the message and the messenger, and increasingly a powerful one.
People learn more from media than any other single source of information. So if we want to understand what's going on in our society in the 21st century, we have to understand media
If you think about media and technology, they're delivering content that is shaping our society. They're shaping our politics, they're shaping our national discourse, and most of all, they're shaping our children's brains and lives and emotions.
We estimate there's somewhere north of 1 billion people who use the internet every single day. That's just a reach that hasn't existed before in terms of media.
Our kids today live on Facebook and cell phones. The diversity of the platforms means that those images are impacting your kid 24/7, and whatever restrictions existed when we were growing up simply don't exist today.
Girls get the message from very early on that what's most important is how they look, that their value, their worth depends on that. And boys get the message that this is what's important about girls. We get it from advertising, we get it from films, we get it from television shows, video games, everywhere we look. So no matter what else a woman does, no matter what else her achievements, their value still depends on how they look.
There is no appreciation for women intellectuals. It's all about the body, not about the brain.
You all saw the famous photo from the weekend of Hillary looking so haggard and looking like 92 years old.
Breast implants, did you have them or not? Because that's all over the internet about you in mainstream media.
I think if you waterboarded Nancy Pelosi, she wouldn't admit to plastic surgery.
The fact that media are so limiting and so derogatory to the most powerful women in the country, then what does it say about media's ability to take any woman in America seriously?
You get a woman in the Oval Office, most powerful person in the world, what's the downside?
You mean besides the PMS and the mood swings?
The media treats women like and it's horrible, and it's like, I don't know how we survive it. I don't know how we rise above it.
We'll stop there.
Thank you. Oh, it makes me equal parts sad and angry. But that says it all, right, doesn't it? A woman's worth is, in this country, determined by how she looks and her sexuality. And that's what young boys are learning too. Oh, okay, great. So now we've given sort of a basic understanding of oppression, that related system of restrictions that are kind of, in this case for women, grouped around appearance and sexuality, along with passivity, non-intellectual, all that, right? So then the question is, how does this relate up to domestic and sexual violence, right? And the idea is that that system of restrictions, it contributes to, but it also is and represents a whole slew, that whole set of gendered stereotypes, expectations, expected treatment, norms, right? All of these sort of codes and scripts that tell us how we ought to treat women and men too, right? They're involved too. And the idea is that this, again, kind of creates that root system, that sort of groundwork that can then play some contributing role to the risk factors for domestic and sexual violence, and at least indirectly may contribute to that risk, right? Because it's operating pervasively, yet in the background. So let's get into both of these a little bit more, those themes that we drew from our double binds. And the first question here, and I think it's especially poignant after the misrepresentation clip, what happens when you objectify someone? I mean, it is something that all of us do to some small degree occasionally, right? To view someone as an object or a thing. But how is our view of someone distorted if we do that, especially if it's prolonged? And feel free to use the chat to answer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So let me go through these. Don't see the person as human, maybe. Yeah. Object is contrasted to subject, agency, right? What do we know about objects? They don't have internal lives. They don't have goals or plans or opinions, right? So yeah, it is a way of sort of draining that humanity, that subjectivity out of a person, right? We steal their agency to self-identify. Good, excellent. So we're doing the definition of them. You can see that very clearly in that clip, right? The idea is that our society determines how women are viewed and how effectively they should see themselves too. So that's a great point, taking away that ability to determine themselves and view themselves in a certain way. Great. It can and often does leads to disrespecting them and demoralizing them, especially when that is pervasive, right? When there's this, as we saw in media, right? This very pervasive exposure to women who are being depicted in an objectified way. So disrespect and demoralize them, again, related to the sort of the dehumanization, right? So absolutely, this sort of draining away of agency, it gets easier to treat a person like an instrument, right? Like a thing for one's own ends. Great. So that's one point. And then that second theme that we pulled out had to do with, again, these stereotypes that come from gender socialization. And in particular, right, we know that typically men are socialized to view sex as a conquest, right? And to see women as that conquest, to view their value in terms of their sex, as we saw. And additionally, to view aggression as an ideal of strength, of masculinity. And the idea is that we could clearly see how that is an issue when it comes to, combining that with this view of women as passive, as dependent, as weaker, plus the fact that they are so routinely objectified sexually in our culture. So you could start to see how these expectations and norms are starting to contribute to women being viewed in this weaker way as mere objects, as mere sexual objects, with the corresponding expectation that men ought to get sex to sort of prove their masculinity, and to do so aggressively if they need to. So the last piece of this I'll talk about has to do with this idea of entitlement. So given everything we just talked about in the background here, there's a question here about, is there any sort of entitlement that men may feel, right? So we know that privilege is, they're unearned benefits, right? They're benefits that you get just by being white or cisgendered or whatever, and they're not earned. But the thing is that when you are used to getting those benefits, the loss of them may feel like a harm, and you may start to feel entitled to them, like they are yours to take. So the question then is, what are the benefits? How do men benefit from women's oppression and that perception of women as inferior? In other words, what are those perks? What are the perks of male privilege based on women's oppression? And again, feel free to use the chat here. Y'all are doing great with the chat. Yeah. Control, yep. Power, respect, control, claiming public spaces. Yeah, right. Having sort of the right to those spaces without even realizing it. Yeah. More likely to be believed, credibility. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Holly. I didn't see that. That was you. Less work and effort needed to succeed in society. Yep. Yeah. So, okay, fantastic. So control, power. Absolutely, right. And we could see how this is actually related to that last one too. Less work and effort needed to succeed in society, right? To flip that, what are the expectations of how women should behave towards men? Well, there's a lot of work involved. There's a lot of labor, right? According to these, again, heterosexist, essentializing stereotypes, women should be taking care of men, they're nurturers. They should be taking care of the family and the household. We know that women still have the second shift problem. Even when they have full-time jobs, they still do the bulk of the housework compared to their male partners, right? So that helps kind of prop men up, right? Now they're kind of more freed up, again, at least in a heterosexual setting, to be able to spend more time at work, get that promotion, and so on. And in addition, if we set up a whole class of people as inferior to this other class, well, yeah, there's going to be immediate power and respect and control and credibility that comes along with that. That's exactly right. So just to wrap this all together here, what's the problem with that? Well, again, when you get used to those privileges, in this case, women's labor, right, along with their inferiority, right, you get used to the privileges that come with that, you may start to feel entitled to them. And the thought is that you may start to feel like you ought to take those things. And when we combine that with the pervasive objectification, sexual objectification of women, these stereotypes that women are submissive and passive and delicate, along with the stereotypes that men are strong and aggressive and masculine, and all of the perks that men get from women's oppression, you can see how we've kind of have that groundwork for these risks for more specific sexual and domestic violence, right? These norms are sort of operating underneath everything else that's going on. And I want to stress too, and this will come up in Lesley's portion too, I'm not suggesting that there's sort of a one-to-one causal relationship here. The idea is that these broader social conditions they can be contributing factors, and they can be contributing factors to these other more direct risk factors that Lesley's going to talk about. So I'll turn it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you. And I wanted to pick up on what you were talking about, Alicia, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention the recent violence that occurred in Boulder, Colorado and Atlanta, Georgia, the active shooter events, and particularly the things that you just mentioned around sexual objectification and dehumanizing, resulting in violence. These, the investigation is ongoing with the spas, the day spas that were attacked in Atlanta. But the observations, the factual observations that we can make are that the shooter targeted Asian-owned businesses and largely targeted Asian women of Asian and Asian American descent. Obviously, there's something to that women were the target. Men were injured and killed as well, and the community is torn apart, and it's a horrible, horrible thing. But at the root of it, it seems like sexual objectification, sexualizing and fetishizing Asian women in particular, and women of color, is at the root of that act of violence. And we can't ignore that. We can't ignore that that's a part of the issue. So hopefully they continue to investigate, and our hearts go out to all the survivors and the communities going through that. When we think about the counter story to objectification, male entitlement, we can think about, well, how do we elevate the voices of women? How do we elevate the voices of all women, Indigenous women, women of color, Black women? We just celebrated Black History Month. We are in Women's History Month. We can tell the stories of women who we can call attention to the inventions and the work and the science and the contributions that they make. We can make an effort to elevate women to leadership positions within businesses and faith communities. We can elect them to political positions. We can honor the voices of our female political leaders, not objectify and name call and scrutinize according to the double binds that you just wrote in the chat. We see that in our media. We see that in our culture. But we can just really try to address the fact that women deserve credit for the work that they do. And there's some resources there. The Mighty Girl, I see this on Facebook. They have a listing of women's accomplishments. And so there might be many resources for things like that, but just calling attention to those that might not get credit, and making sure that we bring that to the forefront. So moving into the second part of our training here, building on the gender depression as the foundation, we're going to really dive into the social ecological model. And that is a model from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It shows us the different levels of the social ecology. We can examine any public health issue and look at the problem across this model, and also look at prevention strategies at each level. It's not just an individual issue. It's not about blaming the victim and just focusing on the person, like, oh, they're just a bad person who perpetrates. Well, they need help as a perpetrator, but what are the systemic issues going on? What are the prevention strategies that we can use across the whole social ecology? So at the individual level, we're looking at personal knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors. I might have misperceptions about domestic and sexual violence, so we're thinking about individual education. That relationship level, think of that as the trainer level. Those are your parents, guardians, educators, coaches, peer influencers. That relationship level are those that can influence individuals. They're teaching classes, they're parenting and modeling healthy behavior, they're coaching healthy masculinity, healthy relationships. So we're training parents and stuff. Organizationally, we're training leaders, business leaders, faith leaders. We're looking at schools and college campuses, workplace policies, and things like that. At the community level, we're looking at the environment. Does it feel safe? Are there community sanctions, laws, and ordinances? Does it feel like a safe and healthy place to live? And then the societal level is your policy, legislation, laws, and it includes things like media, like our American culture and the media that we consume, the national like social norms and things that we're all exposed to, the messages that we receive. So we're going to take all of that in. We're going to weave in a story about Jay throughout so that we kind of humanize this a little bit. So let's take a look at the common risk factors at the individual level. So we're thinking of the lack of nonviolent conflict resolution, not having the skills to have that healthy communication, negotiation, know how to handle, really employing coping skills for when our emotions are high and we're angry and we're in conflict, learning how to handle that well, right? So the risk factors is the lack of those skills and having poor impulse control, which might lead to risk-taking behavior. Having a history of violent victimization. If children experience violence in their youth, obviously that increases their vulnerability and the likelihood that they might be re-victimized later in life. One of the biggest risk factors, particularly for boys, is witnessing domestic violence at home in their youth. And that it's not a cause effect, okay, but it puts them at greater risk and vulnerability for perpetrating domestic violence later in life if they don't get the interventions and learning what healthy is supposed to look like. If the model that they see is violent, it is more likely that they will repeat it if they're not learning what healthy and respectful relationships are supposed to look like. So that is definitely one that is a huge risk factor and could set them up for future violence or victimization in terms of youth experiencing future victimization. Substance use, if they're coping in their youth and adolescence, if they're using alcohol or drugs to cope with trauma, that certainly is a risk factor. And I just want to reiterate that anything like alcohol or mental illness, et cetera, those things or unemployment, we're going to talk about that later, those things don't cause domestic and sexual violence. We know that. But certainly there is a risk factor. It might contribute to exacerbating an already ripe situation that's moving toward unhealthy and into abusive. So it certainly can contribute to the problem. It is not a cause of domestic and sexual violence. We want to make that clear. So those are the common risk factors. Let's meet Jay. Jay grows up in a difficult home. His dad is in a very lucrative job while his mom is a homemaker. His dad is often very even-tempered, but Jay has noticed that some things can really set his dad off pretty quickly. Leftovers for dinner, having an unclean bedroom, and his dad gets really angry. When this happens, Jay's dad flies into a rage, yelling at Jay's mom, insulting her, and breaking objects around the house. Jay's mom doesn't really talk about these incidents, even though they're becoming somewhat regular. Eventually, Jay starts angrily exploding at his mom when he is upset with her. So think about what Jay is seeing and experiencing, and what are those risk factors at the individual level for Jay. What's going on for him that's putting him at risk for future perpetration or victimization? What do you think? Put that in the chat for us. What is it that's setting Jay up as risk factors that could put him at risk for future perpetration or victimization? Let's see what we got here.
Okay. So what we have here, so not talking about it, about the violence against his mom may make him feel that he held accountable for his actions. Oh, good points there. So it's not talked about, so it's okay. Yeah. And he's seeing the violent behavior, so that modeling, normalizing that violence because he's witnessing it. Yep. Yeah, and it's relevant that it is his dad treating his mom a certain way, because that may model how he's treating women, right? How we should treat women. Destructive behavior, exactly, good.
Yes, absolutely. So Jay is learning that to solve my problems, I can just, yell and shout and get my way. And so certainly that's setting him up for what's normal in a relationship. How do I solve problems? How do I relate to my partner in the future? So he's definitely seeing and witnessing things that are having a negative health impact on how he views the world, how he views relationships and family. So we'll keep that in mind as we go forward. I want to pair, before we talk about prevention with this, I want to also talk about the relationship level, because like I mentioned, it's sort of that train the trainer. We want to think about those as well, and we'll talk about prevention together with individual relationships. So, common risk factors at the relationship level: poor child-parent interactions, family conflict. If there's a lot of yelling and still like what Jay is experiencing at home, conflict. And so if the ground is ripe for, conflict that's happening, and it allows power and control to really take root, that becomes domestic violence. If someone is trying to have power and control and dominate the family, and make all the decisions, it certainly can move from unhealthy to abusive. For Jay, like influences with associating with delinquent peers, or for youth in general, some youth might have a lot of pressure to get into risk-taking behaviors, shoplifting, stealing, gang involvement, drug use, skipping school, truancy, all those pressures, especially if it feels like an escape from what's happening at home. So there's a lot of risk factors within peer culture, peer groups, that might be an influencing factor for abuse, for perpetrating abuse or experiencing victimization. So at school, Jay is hanging out with his friends, and it's a group of boys who wrestle and punch each other to settle bets and win arguments. They joke around about not being weak or a whiny girl, and will playfully hit each other whenever one of them says something that's gay. When Jay starts hanging out with this group more and more, he seeks them out, especially when his dad starts to get angry. As they get older, this group of friends get into more trouble, drinking, stealing, and generally reveling and breaking the rules. So obviously he has a lot of negative influences and the things he's hearing from his peers. So I want to kind of hand that off to you. What are the risk factors for violence perpetration that are now being reinforced? So he's witnessing this at home, but what's also being reinforced for Jay? Go ahead and put that in the chat as well. It is normal. Yep. Yep, absolutely. Just boys being boys. It's normalized. Yep. Yep, he's definitely being socialized to believe that talking about girls in really objectifying ways is normal, and taking these risks, participating in risk-taking behavior is just kind of the way that you are a man, and that, and he's getting a lot of negative influences that are hurting him. Mm-hmm. Good. Yes, reinforcing unhealthy masculinity, rigid gender roles and gender norms are being reinforced. Unhealthy masculinity, degrading women, disrespecting, and a lack of positive role models. Yes, definitely has a lack of positive role models. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I want to tie that into prevention. And so this video is from an organization called A Call to Men out of New York. And we use a lot of their resources. They do a lot of work around what they call the man box. And one of our programs at Resilience is work around engaging men as leaders and in violence prevention. And it's our Men as Allies program. The work that we do is about looking at the man box and deconstructing those unhealthy messages that men and boys receive about being in charge and being in control, being tough and not crying. And because all of those messages have such a negative impact on their healthy growth and their ability to have healthy relationships, in the future. So we're going to take a look at this. It leads into our prevention conversation.
When I was a little kid, I was really good at just being me. But I grew distant from my true feelings. I was shaped by what society expected from me. Holding on to my masculine traits because they were encouraged. I lost sight of my more sensitive qualities. I became disconnected from myself, and then disconnected from others. I was taught to be in control of everything around me.
No, come over here. No, come this way.
And that girls were not my equal. That would have devastating effects on my life and those around me. I responded to stress with anger. I hid my emotions. I felt the need to dominate and control others.
No, listen to what I'm telling you. I know what I'm talking about.
All of which was bad for my health. I reject those rigid notions of manhood. I never use violence. I value women, girls, and non-binary people. I speak out against injustice. Healthy manhood makes me happier and healthier. Now I'm more in touch with my emotions. I just feel a whole lot better. I value and respect all people. Healthy manhood prevents problems in my community. I can be myself. I can express my version of masculinity. I can create a world where all men and boys are loving and respectful, and all women and girls are valued and safe.
It's so important to really allow boys to feel and experience their emotions, and to allow them to grow their empathy and compassion, and not to stunt it by telling them not to cry, man up, be tough. Letting them really have healthy relationships in the future really requires undoing and rethinking how we tell boys to be tough and strong, and how we tell boys particularly to be men. So that's part of it. So when we think about prevention, and certainly about prevention education, there's some things that we know are recommended from the CDC, and really are a part of the curriculum that we do here at Resilience. So teaching safe and healthy relationships, we really need to promote respect, consent, and let both young people and adults know what is healthy, unhealthy, and abusive in relationships, and really promote compassion and empathy, really building empathy, which will, I think, help reduce victim blaming and help create more support systems where we really believe survivors, support survivors, and build systems of community, that really promote healthy relationships. We need to engage youth in pro-social learning. And so promoting the positive, really equipping youth to be peer leaders, learning healthy relationship skills and bystander intervention skills, so that they are calling their peers in, by acknowledging when something is racist, sexist, violent, abusive, hurtful, harmful, like naming it and really calling our peers into conversation, modeling healthy behavior to them, and letting them change their behavior. If we just call them out and yell at them or embarrass them, they're going to be defensive. But if we really try to call them into the conversation, model healthy behavior, hopefully that will lessen defensiveness. Also, we want to engage parents and guardians. We want to make sure that they're equipped with information and skill building. I also do training for parents and adults on how to help teens who are experiencing dating violence and recognizing that. So I certainly could do a training on that. We want to think also about equipping coaches and educators as those influencers, as those trainers that are passing along skills to youth in particular. So we want to engage influential adults. Some of the programs that we have here at Resilience include training coaches. So Coaching Boys into Men and Athletes as Leaders are two programs where we engage K-12 sports athletic coaches, high school coaches, and they do a conversation every week throughout their season, and it's about a 9 to 10 week program. So Coaching Boys into Men is for boy sports teams, Athletes as Leaders is for anyone on female sports teams, but certainly regardless of gender identity, all youth should have opportunities to participate in this. So the conversations are about dating violence. What is digital dating abuse? What is sexual harassment and sexual assault? What does consent mean? And so it's really important for youth to know what these are so that they can respond in situations where they are the active bystander, where they are called upon to call their friends in and have those conversations and name behaviors. So really empowering them as peer leaders and teaching those bystander skills. Our other program that we do with schools is Live Respect. And this program also is from A Call to Men. This is their signature youth curriculum. And we have been doing that for a few years. We reach hundreds of students every year and can do that within classrooms or church youth groups or faith communities, youth programs, after school programs, things like that. Community level. So when we think about community level risk factors, and again, like poverty doesn't cause domestic violence, but certainly if there are a lack of high paying jobs, if unemployment is high, if there's not a lot of affordable housing, I mean, that sounds like our community right now. We're experiencing a lot of those issues, and we're in a pandemic. People are having a lot of complex issues that they're facing. And so, you know, poverty, food insecurity, you know, all the things that have really hit home this year in particular for folks locally. And so a lot of those things can set people up for not having resources, for being dependent. And so if they are economically dependent because of these factors, that increases their individual risk for domestic and sexual violence. So let's revisit Jay's story. So let's assume at this point for Jay that he has not had any prevention program interventions. So at this point, he begins dating, right? So Maya met Jay in high school, and they've been together for 5 years. Maya, who has a high school education, is having trouble finding a job. Her neighborhood doesn't have many opportunities, and she can't find a car to travel to work. So a lot of issues there. When Maya confides in a neighbor that Jay can get really scary sometimes, the neighbor shrugs and says, every couple fights. Maya is feeling more and more isolated. So let's think about that in terms of community level risk factors. Go ahead and type in the chat the things that you heard from that story that might be not just risk factors, but let's think of protective factors. What could be in place as a protective factor in the community that would have helped Maya and Jay? I'm going to go back to the story. So what are the protective factors here that might help Maya and Jay? You go ahead and type in the chat. I'll share too that you might be familiar with the power and control wheel. So that is a handout that has all the different tactics of power and control that perpetuate domestic and sexual violence. And isolation is a huge one. And so when there's isolation and isolation is allowed to thrive, domestic violence, the perpetrator is able to continue and escalate their tactics of abuse because now no one sees me, right? There's a lack of accountability if I have isolated my partner. So community level protective factor could be reducing isolation as much as we can. And that's not waving a magic wand to get rid of domestic violence, but at least it could contribute to creating protective communities that could feel like safer environments where we are holding perpetrators accountable, where we are increasing contact with our neighbors. So I want to share a few like concrete ideas around that. Things like reducing isolation by having neighborhood watch, block parties, community gardens. People are out on their porch talking to their neighbors. Those kinds of things create conversation and accountability and, hey, I see you every day, so that there's at least a reduction of community level isolation for creating some level of protection. Also creating supportive environments within faith communities and workplaces so that those support networks are strengthened. Having parks and recreation, and this is going to sound like far-fetched, or why is this connected? But like even community beautification projects, that sounds really simple, or even unrelated. But if like we have lots of tulips and parks and things here in Holland, and that is a part of feeling like it's a safe community. It is a part of creating a connected community. Community connection was identified by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as the greatest protective factor at the community level for domestic violence. Community connection and cohesion is a community level prevention factor. In communities that are disconnected, where there's like dilapidation and lack of resources, people don't feel cared about. They don't feel like they have a sense of self-worth. They get desperate, right? So when people feel like that they're valued and safe, they're going to hopefully operate in a healthier way. We also want to think about concrete community supports. Ottawa County is incredibly collaborative. We have many, many organizations that are tackling issues like affordable housing and jobs and all the, domestic violence agencies and everything. So that is a huge protective factor, that there's agency collaboration and communication and concrete supports for families to promote healthy and safe families. I also want to mention, and this relates to a program that we have here at Resilience, that if Jay's workplace had a training program on domestic violence, at Resilience, we have the Resilient Spaces program, and that's a training program for businesses, supervisors, employers, and including HR, human resources. We also train faith leaders and salon professionals. But in Jay's case, if his business, where he works, if they had that workplace training and he was able to learn about, let's say he's a mid-level manager and he participates, and he was able to learn about power and control dynamics and healthy relationships and how to support survivors, it might help supplement some of the earlier education that he didn't get around dating violence, and that he could be referred to his human resources representative who might suggest a better treatment program or some services for him, counseling, things that might support him in kind of unlearning what has been modeled to him throughout his life. So thinking about community level strategies, but also workplace policies, faith community policies. Do we have policies that promote, that require training on domestic and sexual violence? Do our schools, colleges, businesses have written policies within their employee handbooks on not just sexual harassment in the workplace, but domestic violence, sexual assault, and around creating protective environments, preventative environments where we're promoting really safe climates, very safe work and school climates that promote healthy relationships, bystander intervention skills. People are trained, and that's the culture within organizations, et cetera. And so the risk factor is the lack of that, lack of having those training programs and policies in place. All right, did I miss anything from the chat on that, Alicia?
There were a few, let's see. So we had an earlier one about noting that Jay doesn't have any other tools in his toolbox when he's around his friends to deal with his emotions, right? It's all just flashing out. disrespect and a lack of positive role models. I think we talked about that one. Community-wise, being vulnerable and asking for help, having community resources, learning what a healthy relationship is. So yeah, one idea there is just making a community, like you said, in which people feel like they will be supported, so that they are more likely to reach out and ask for help, as well as all those positive modelings of relationships that you talked about. Yeah, I think that was everybody.
Great, thank you so much. All right, moving on here. All right, so yeah, community, I feel like we did this, but yeah, we talked, I think I just stayed on my last slide, but we had this conversation. So we want to move on to kind of looking back. If I didn't say, I think I said all of these things as we just talked. Yeah, yep, community connectedness, strengthening those economic supports for women and families. And I just wanted to mention, like earlier in our story, we heard that Maya was having trouble. She didn't have a car. She was looking for a job. She was having a lot of economic issues. And so strengthening economic supports for women and families is a recommended strategy from CDC. Like that, certainly if those can be supported, women have access to supports. They, even things like maternity leave, paid family leave, all of those things, job training, they only serve to help to lessen the barriers that survivors have. So the more that we can be proactive about that, we're setting people up for better situations and reducing barriers. So let's do society. Okay, so this is our last one of the social ecological model. And so we're thinking here of legislation, laws, social norms at we're thinking whether we're thinking statewide or nationally, all and like the messages that we receive through media, that kind of thing. So certainly cultural norms that support aggression, right? So things that are common risk factors, norms that make violence seem normal. Like if I asked you, what do you call a man's undershirt tank top? What do you call that? You know that it's a common vernacular that's called a wife beater. I have no idea why that's called that, but hopefully that gets eradicated from our vocabulary along with a lot of other terms. But like normalizing violence. We have violent terms for things, even sexualized vernacular for sex, things like hit that, whatever is said about that. It's all violent, smacking, hitting terminology for sexual acts. So things like that. So the way we talk about a problem, but also norms around aggression, and that aggression is okay, or aggression is how we handle conflict. The lack of sanctions, laws, community ordinances, policies. So the risk factors are that there's weak or absent policies, really, so that domestic and sexual violence are not perpetuated, right? And also having really rigid gender norms and promoting unhealthy, harmful norms about masculinity. And we talked about that, and we watched that video all about the messages that young men receive about being strong and tough and not showing emotion. But also around, I think back to the double binds of like emotionality. I saw something in the list earlier about like, if we show emotion, we're seen as weak as women, or, daffy or whatever, that we're just like crying. So there's very harmful stereotypes around that. we'll revisit that in a minute and talk about prevention. But I want to think back to and kind of wrap up our story. So Jay and Maya have been in a relationship for nearly 15 years. They have a 9-year-old son, Jackson. Jay's abusive behavior has worsened, and he attempts to control Maya and insists on having power over decision-making. And while Jay never intended to repeat his father's behavior, his sense of needing to be in control has been reinforced by his peers and by cultural norms about masculinity. Maya became increasingly aware that her community and education have not prepared her for Jay's abusive behavior. Maya reflects on her own education and notices that their local school district does not include dating violence prevention education in their K-12 health curriculum. So there's an opportunity, right? So thinking about, and you can react to that in the chat, feel free to respond with your thoughts on that. I want to get right into relating that to prevention. So cultural leaders, I want to think about how, we can model respectful behavior and nonviolence and not dominating in our leadership styles. So when we think about our politicians, our national leaders, even our faith leaders and local leaders, they can lead by example and show that domination and violence is not how we treat one another and is not a part of our leadership approach, so that we are promoting equity and inclusion and racism and sexism have no place in how we lead in organizations and in our society. And certainly it's all about treating people with dignity, value, worth, and that everybody deserves respect and being treated with equity and inclusion. That's a really important one. And thinking about policies and laws that mitigate violence, this is probably a few decades ago, I saw this example. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, there was an active group of men, like an action-oriented group around healthy masculinity and ending violence against women. And they were organizing with their local mayor's office, and they got these signs. So in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they had these road signs. They look like speed limit signs, and they say domestic violence free zone. And so throughout Cambridge, Massachusetts, they had these road signs, and it was just a message to the community that this is a domestic violence free community. Domestic violence has no place in our community. And so they organized to make it a visual message, an outward message. So it could be something like that, but certainly there's other ordinances or laws or legislation that could be elevated to do similar things. Very importantly, that last point, I touched on it, but just that thinking intersectionally that we need to think about violence prevention and pairing that with anti-racism work. And anti-violence work goes along with anti-racism work, goes along with anti-sexism work. And to the earlier part of our training, really addressing oppressions, various oppressions. We're all in this together. And so the more we can organize and promote justice and equality and nonviolence, there's a lot of committees and organizations in the community working to do that. Here in Ottawa County, the Momentum Center, LEDA, the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance, and many, many others. And so I just want to talk, kind of say that collaboration, that work matters. And so that's definitely a prevention strategy. Before I close with questions, I want to relate it back to our story. I'll just flip back here. So the last section here where Maya was thinking about an opportunity for education, for prevention education. One idea would be to, I know here in Michigan, we have the Michigan model for health curriculum is the recommended health curriculum for our state. And it is the sexual health curriculum, including HIV, healthy relationships, sexual health, reproductive health. And there's an introduced bill. It's sitting in committee as an introduced bill, House Bill number 5500. It's definitely, it's all marked up and edits the original to enhance adding consent education, which is missing, adding consent education, adding sexual assault education, adding more, definitions and language around bystander intervention, understanding healthy relationships and healthy relationship skills. And so just really augmenting curriculum that might be outdated so that we're promoting pro-social behaviors and skill building. So an opportunity is that Maya could do would be to connect with community organizations and lobbyists and work to, really advocate for reform around, mandated prevention education in our state, something like that. So that's one example. If you have other examples, feel free to put them in the chat as well. And we want to open it up. We covered a lot of things, and I want to open it up for questions and see where everyone's at. What questions do you have? Go ahead and write in the chat as well, and we can discuss. So no questions so far. Are you guys seeing any questions in the chat? No? Okay. I want to make sure we have time for any, we have time for discussion. We have about 15 minutes left for questions. Okay. I'm getting some direct messages. I will respond to those as well. And certainly there's ways, someone's asking about volunteering and getting involved. And so Holly, if you could post our website and volunteer page, that would be lovely. Okay. What I just want to show you a few things. So you will get the slides, you will get the recording. At the end here, we have all these links to the tools. I think I told you a little bit at the beginning about this connecting the dots, and it's really a great tool through CDC. They have different types of violence. You can look at youth violence, suicide prevention, sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and you can click the buttons and it brings up the risk and protective factors, and it's a neat interactive tool. So if you're kind of wanting more information or wondering where this information came from, there's some great tools listed there as well.
Lesley, a question came in. Curious about how organizations measure the efficacy of some of the prevention programs you mentioned.
Okay, yep. One of the things that we do, we evaluate everything that we do. And so we choose programs that are evidence-based and like proven to be effective. We look at the research behind it, the pilot program and the data. And then we ourselves, when we implement, we do pre and post, particularly with our 3 youth programs. that I explained earlier, Live Respect, Coaching Boys into Men, Athletes as Leaders. We do pre and post with students. And so we get those results back. And we've had overwhelmingly positive results, and that we share with funders and do data reports on. There was a huge, so one of the, I don't have the number exactly in my head because I didn't know you were going to ask me this, but there was a huge jump. It was about 64% increase from pre-test to post-test on one question about the question that we chose to measure on bystander willingness to intervene as a bystander. And so from pre-test to post-test, it was a 64% increase in willingness to intervene for that measure. And the question asks if they see someone trying to have sexual, making sexual advances towards someone who appears to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs, would they intervene? And the post-test showed that they had a better understanding that that was abusive. They also had a better understanding that they needed to intervene, and their willingness increased. So we definitely have positive outcomes. Yeah, I hope that answered your question, but we definitely look for proven evidence-based programs to begin with, and then do our own evaluation as well to make sure we're on track. Is there anything else that would be helpful to ask or to cover?
So I have a question or video is accessible on the Resilience website. So I'll let you guys answer that because I'm not sure.
I'm not sure yet where we'll post it, potentially on our website. We have a YouTube channel, but let me check it. We will share it with you. We will share the recording. And when we communicate in an email, I'll let you know where.
I did also get a question about any certificate of attendance for today, and I also don't know.
Right. Great question. I saw that one. I didn't make up one for this, but if you are needing a particular, like to show an employer or something, please email me. It's easy to contact me at prevention@resiliencemi.org or Lesley C@resiliencemi.org. Those both come to me. This is our information for our 24-hour helpline and resources. Please share this with anyone who might need to reach out. And we're on Facebook and Instagram, and we have lots of social media campaigns and messaging, and we encourage you to follow along with us. We look forward to hosting future programs, and I will follow up with you after this with all the slides and everything. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. On behalf of Dr. Alicia LaGuardia-LoBianco, and thank you, Holly, as our moderator. We thank you, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.